As we continue in the book of Exodus, we have talked about the fact in chapter 1 that the nation of Israel is beset with difficulties, one after another. They've grown into a large group of individuals that actually have been placed under subjugation by the Egyptians. They do not have freedom. And over the span of time, because of the way that freedom has been taken away and the mindset that now exists after centuries, the people really have an idea that they cannot actually survive on their own without the taskmasters, without the Egyptians telling them exactly what to do. They really can't think for themselves. They're trying, but it's been difficult. Chapter 2, chapter 3, and chapter 4, Moses comes on the scene, and we talked about the preparation for a purpose that would be the most monumental endeavor of his life. He carried with it quite a few different items. In the process, he ends up fleeing out of Egypt. Then after 4 decades, he's told he needs to go back. He doesn't want to go. The training for service, as far as the life of Moses is concerned, is to begin with a training that comes upon one who really is very reluctant. He doesn't want to go back. He recognizes the suffering of the nation of Israel, but he doesn't want to go back. And comes up with one excuse after another, and finally actually gives in, but it takes a great deal of effort for that change and that choice actually to be made. When Moses and Aaron actually approach Pharaoh, chapter 5 of Exodus, there is a pushback from the Egyptians. In fact, in this particular setting, in this particular chapter, the picture really begins in the end of chapter 4. Towards the end, verse 29 and following of Exodus 4, Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the children of Israel, and Aaron spoke all the words which the Lord had spoken to Moses. Aaron ends up being the spokesperson for his brother. He did signs and miracles in the sight of the people. Verse 31, so the people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel and that he had looked on their affliction, then they bowed their heads and worshipped. A great deal of delight that the problems that have been afflicted upon them may be coming to an end. This has been going on for 4 centuries. And now the stories that their forefathers have told them, been telling them, to this new nation or this new generation of slaves for the Egyptians, they have an understanding that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is finally coming to their defense. But in chapter 5, there's a backlash. There's a backlash of defiance from the Egyptians. I mean, after all, they have had this workforce, this labor force, in their possession as long as they can remember. It goes back several centuries. They do not want to let these people go. So in chapter 5 and verse number 1, Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, thus says the Lord God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. There's a demand. So there's a delight on the part of the nation. At the very end of chapter 4, there is a demand that is made by Moses and Aaron in the presence of Pharaoh. And then verse number 2, Pharaoh said, who's the Lord? Who's the Lord that I should obey his voice? I don't recognize your puny deity. As far as Egypt is concerned, I am deity. So why should I listen to a group of slaves? Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go. Denial of the demand. I mean, well, that's something that actually would be anticipated. It's interesting, the very next statement that is made by Moses and Aaron. Verse number 3. The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go 3 days' journey into the desert and sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword. And it's interesting, what they are saying is we need to do this, else our God will become angry with us. The God of the Hebrews will become angry with us, and we will bear the brunt of that kind of judgment against us. So initially the statement is not that God is going to bring any kind of affliction on the Egyptians. It's going to be brought initially upon us. That doesn't raise any kind of sympathy in the mind of Pharaoh at all. This denial is involved in several things. In fact, in verse number 4, he says to Moses and Aaron, "Why have you taken the people away from their work?" In fact, in verse number 6, the same day Pharaoh commanded the taskmaster, saying, "You shall no longer give the people straw to make brick as before. You supplied them with that straw previously as they're in those clay pits making brick with that straw. Now I want you to make them gather their own straw, but you don't reduce the quota that they are required to make. You shall lay upon them the quota of the bricks which they have made before. You shall not reduce it." There is the denial. Not only do I not like you coming before me, demanding me that you let your people go and worship your God, I don't recognize your God. And I'm going to make it more difficult as far as the labor that I've inflicted upon the nation of the Hebrews anyway. So in verse number 15, the officers of the children of Israel came and cried out to Pharaoh, saying, "Why are you dealing thus with your servants, with us? You're making us gather the material that you used to provide, and you're not diminishing the quota of bricks at all. The taskmasters have made it more difficult for us." So the statement that is made beginning in verse 15 down through verse number 19 is a statement of despair. The delight that preceded that demand, that was met with denial, has now turned into despair. This is worse than it was before Moses and Aaron actually arrived on the scene. We think we'd been better off if they never showed up in the first place. The labor that you're placing upon us is atrocious. It was bad to begin with, but now it's worse. And then in verse number 20 and 21, as they came out from Pharaoh, they met Moses and Aaron, who stood there to meet with them, and they said to Moses and Aaron, "Let the Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us abhorrent in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, to put a sword in their hand to kill us." There's a denouncement. We're not going to follow you. We don't believe now from this point on anything that you say. This is ridiculous. You have brought this kind of harsh punishment upon us. It was bad enough before. You've made it worse. A denouncement of individuals that really were there reluctantly to begin with. Individuals that were there ultimately to help deliver the nation out of that bondage. But if you start thinking about the fact that this group of slaves, this nation of slaves, they're in the northern part of Egypt, being held under the thumb of the military might of Egypt, had to anticipate some kind of pushback. The Egyptians are not about to let them go because they have a good thing going. So in verse number 22 and 23, the last two verses of this 5th chapter, Moses returned to the Lord and said, "Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak your name, he's done evil to this people. Neither have you delivered your people at all." Doubt among the leadership. Just not sure what's going to happen. Pushback. When individuals that have a righteous cause finally rise up against their oppressors, you've got to anticipate that the oppressors are going to push back against the oppressed. That's been true for thousands of years. It's still true today. Deliverance actually takes place. The journey of that deliverance starts in verse 1 of chapter 6, is not concluded until the very last of chapter 12. In the process, the beginning of chapter 6, God says to Moses, "I want you to tell the children of Israel, I'm the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians," verse number 6. "I'll rescue you from their bondage." You haven't yet. "I'll redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments." We haven't seen any indication of that. Verse number 7, "I'll take you as my people, and I will be your God, and then you shall know that I'm the Lord your God, who brings you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians." It's going to be a process. It's foolish to believe this is going to happen overnight, or that there will be no pushback by those that are bent on evil against a certain segment of humanity. Again, that process is something that spans history and still is something that you see even in this 21st century. And then the statement's made in chapter 6, verse number 8. I'll bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I'll give it to you as a heritage. The promise is something that will unfold, but it will not happen overnight. Things seem to become worse before they become better. You know, I've heard the old adage or the cliche that the night is darkest just before the dawn. And that's very much true here. In the process of that deliverance of the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage. You start looking through history, and even in our modern time today, you'll find application of these same principles and really the same kind of scenario, these same characteristics, these same ingredients still exist in that process of deliverance. There's always pushback by the oppressor against those who no longer want to be oppressed. Interesting events in Exodus. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.